Well, greetings, folks. Welcome to today's webinar from the Council for British Research in the Levant. Today's topic is we're going to have a book launch by Dr. Gabriel Varghese. His new book that came out of Palgrave Press in March 2020 is called Palestinian Theatre in the West Bank, Our Human Faces. This broadcast is coming to you from East Jerusalem and the Kenyan Institute, which is the East Jerusalem branch of the Council for British Research in the Levant, which has its headquarters in London, as well as a center here in East Jerusalem and one in Amman, Jordan. The Council for British Research in the Levant is an independent British educational charity that supports independent research in social sciences and humanities. And we receive the bulk of our funding from the British Academy. We're very excited today to have an event that is a little bit different from some of the previous events that we've done in the past, but overall, which basically tries to shed light on some of the some of the best academic research that is coming out these days that is pertinent to the Levant. And today we have a very interesting book on Palestinian theatre, as I said, by Dr. Gabriel Varghese. As I said, the book came out just this past March. Dr. Varghese is a former CBRL postdoc fellow whose research engages in anti, post, and decolonial theatre, performance, and literature, and questions they raise about social movements, dramaturgies of urban life, and regimes of gender, sexuality, and race. He's also a playwright, theatre director, and co-artistic director of Sandpit Arts, an award-winning platform for producing film, music, and performance events, and holds a PhD from Exeter University. Today's event will be a discussion between Dr. Varghese and Dr. Kristin Flade, who herself is a performance scholar and art author. The focus of Dr. Flade's research is ethnographic and artistic works, particularly their focus on representations of violence, political conflict, and the potential of negotiating the struggle for human rights in performance, theatre, and the arts. She's the author of her own book entitled The Good Pain, ? Applied Theatre and Social Circus in Palestine, which came out in 2018. Kristin holds a PhD from the Free University in Berlin and is also joining us from Berlin, and Dr. Varghese from London, and myself, as I said previously, from East Jerusalem. I will hand off now to Dr. Flade to start the discussion. Okay, with that short but brief introduction to our webinar today, I hand things off to Dr. Flade. Take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for setting up this beautiful occasion. I'm very happy to be here and to be discussing to Gabriel. And I'm really, I don't know, I just want to delve right in with also, Tawfiq, how you mentioned that maybe Palestinian theatre is not the predominant subject of the Centre for the British Research in the Levant, by kind of contextualizing a bit what has been my own starting point, but also with Gabriel and I, who shared fieldwork during our time in Palestine. What was a question that we've encountered most frequently, namely, what they have theatre. Which kind of was a bit of an irritation to begin with. It seemed like somewhat belittling to some extent, maybe somewhat surprised in other scenarios, and perhaps really only just blatantly ignorant, because which culture does not know culture? I think for me personally, that was really kind of a very strong motivation. Of course, Palestinians have culture, and of course they have theatre. And I think that kind of leads me to ask you, Gabriel, you've been asked that question in different contexts, and perhaps you could just kind of jump right in and explain or just elaborate a bit how you felt when you received such a question.
Yeah, I get asked this question all the time. When I was doing my PhD and people would ask what the topic is, and you say, you know, Palestinian theatre, that's exactly the first response that people give, what they have theatre. And I think that kind of, and it's happened everywhere actually, not just in the UK, but in Palestine, in the West Bank, Jerusalem, the 48 territories, you know, people just seem to be unfamiliar with the very idea that Palestinians living in the West Bank would also be producing theatre works. And I think that kind of speaks to the sorts of stereotypes there are about Palestinians. Either they're terrorists or they're victims. So the very discourse on Palestine and Palestinians seems to be kind of reverberating across these two nodes. So suddenly you have to introduce to people the idea that, you know, people living under settler colonial occupation are also capable of creating, appreciating, discussing, reproducing works of art. And it's not just theatre, of course, that gets produced in Palestine. There are all kinds, you know, textiles as well, visual arts, film, and so on and so forth. It's a question I've had. I mean, the most surprising is when West Bankers ask me, because when I first went out on fieldwork, I expected, because we hear the Freedom Theatre and Ashtar so often in the West because they have so many touring productions going on. So when you're actually in Palestine and no one's heard of these theatres, it kind of takes you back a bit. When I was in Jenin a couple of years ago, the Freedom Theatre is basically based in Jenin refugee camp, and then of course you have Jenin town, and between the two it's probably 10-15 minute walk, but I came across so many people in Jenin town who had no idea that there was this world famous theatre, you know, just a 10-minute walk away.
Yeah, I think that was pretty much also my experience. But you mentioned two companies already, like the Freedom Theatre and Ashtar Theatre, which you also said like had this kind of world famous claim to them. When you first encountered Palestinian theatre, was that on an international stage and in a context in Britain, for example, or did you actually travel to Palestine first and then had your
The first time I saw a production, a play produced by Palestinians, which was Richard II, at the at Shakespeare's Globe's Globe to Globe Festival in 2012, and I mean that was the first time I'd seen Palestinians on stage. And coming back to your earlier question, I have to admit that I was also one of those people that was surprised when I first sort of encountered Palestinian theatre that there was this tradition in Palestine. So when I was in Palestine, I mean I was a bit more sort of acclimatized to it, but the first time I saw Palestinians on the stage, that was a bit of a surprise. And it was interesting that they picked Richard II, because it's such a complicated play, but it speaks to so many different dynamics across the what we refer to as the Arab world.
Yeah, you just mentioned in passing the tradition of theatre in Palestine, and I think for the audience to maybe not get a very comprehensive overview of everything that's in the book, but what is certainly in the book, and to have several entry points, I think that is our task today. I think what I was really impressed by is how detailedly and really how comprehensively you managed to give like this beautiful history or historical account of how theatre practices, how performance practices, applied theatre practices really stemmed from decades back and before. But what you focus on in your first chapter is really like showing there is a tradition without a doubt, and you show how from the very beginning those companies, and you focus on 5 of them, and I maybe would ask you to give like a small account of how you decided for that scope, but how all these companies have like really different agendas with them in terms of like their own aesthetic interests, let's say, but also how they are generally working under a frame that you also throughout the book try to follow as a threat, which is like creating and maintaining maybe challenging narratives of and by and about Palestinians, and with that kind of performative practice contributing to the national identity and to the national liberation struggle of Palestine as at large. And I think perhaps we cannot detail, I suppose, the everything in the historical account, but I think something that really struck me was how there was a kind of fine-tuning in, let's say, the company's outset to really first and foremost cater to the political needs of their audiences and really respond to those. So perhaps you could give like a small example of when you first heard about this in the accounts that you deliver in the book, which are your conversations with practitioners about their past and present. So what struck you as a really remarkable example of that?
Okay. I mean, that's a lot to unpack. I suppose my point of departure, or my starting point in the book, is the end of the first Intifada in '93, and the theatre companies that arose during the Oslo period and thereafter. But in order to discuss those, I've had to, in the book, go back to the '70s, because the kind of the theatre troops in the '70s were actually laying the groundwork for the sort of companies and works that came afterwards. So, for example, the founders of Ashtar Theatre were also trained under the Hakawati company, Francois Abu Salim, and not just training, but they helped to build the theatre, like physically. They physically built redesigned and refurbished what is now the Palestine National Theatre building. But of course, theatre in Palestine has a much longer tradition. So it doesn't just go back to the '70s. My going back to post-67 allowed me to talk about the '80s and the '90s. But really, research by people like Hala Nassar, for example, provides evidence that there's been theatre in Palestine from the late 19th century. And of course, all across what we refer to as the Arab world, there are different kinds of performance traditions. There's the Hakawati storytelling tradition. There's the Karagoz, the shadow puppetry, related, very much related to the sort of performances that are taking place in Ottoman Turkey. I mean, you know, one of the things I was really surprised by was that the first performance of Hamlet, for example, in anywhere across the Arab world, was in 1907 in Gaza. And of course, I mean, there are reasons why you would pick, you know, under given the sort of circumstances that Palestinians were living in at the time, and the idea that that Zionist immigrants were coming in and stealing the land. So there's a kind of birthright sort of element in Hamlet, isn't there? So there's a reason for putting on these kinds of plays. So, so to answer the second part of your question, when I approached my research, which started off as a PhD, by the way, I decided to case study 5 theatre companies: the Ashtar Theatre in Ramallah, Al-Kasaba again in Ramallah, Al-Harah Theatre based in Beit Jala, the Freedom Theatre and Al-Rowwad, also based in the Aida refugee camp. And the reason I chose these was because, first of all, they're what I would call the major companies producing works at the moment, in the sense that they have had a continuous delivery of outputs from when they were founded. They have established premises, and they have global links as well. So it's not just performing at festivals around the world. They have links to chapters in different countries that fundraise for them, that do publicity for them, that help bring productions across. So so in a sense, the book is a kind of macro level study. This isn't to say that these are the only companies in Palestine producing theatre. There are so many, and within the last kind of 2 or 3 years, many others have come up, have been established all across the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. But at the time that I was working on the PhD and writing the book, these were actually the ones with the highest, the kind of global sort of profile.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. So I think we understand well kind of the scope in terms of the geographical also limitation that you gave yourself and your research endeavor. Before we delve in more in terms of the content of the book, would you comment briefly about your methodological approach in terms of like you've done this PhD in the drama department at Exeter University. Your background is in different disciplines. So how did you navigate approaching this subject on an academic level?
I mean, it kind of took a while to find my sort of footing. But I suppose in terms of methodology, I was very much interested in a performance analysis kind of approach. So actually being in rehearsal rooms, speaking to actors, watching performances, re-watching performances, speaking to playwrights where I could, to directors, and also audiences in the foyer and, you know, elsewhere. So that was the first thing. The second thing was a kind of mixed methods sort of approach. So as well as kind of participant observation in workshops and so on, interviewing the theatre going public. Not many of those interviews made it into the book, but that's kind of, I suppose you sort of live and learn, you sort of refine your interviews as you go along. So the aim, in fact, of using this methodology was to center the voices of Palestinian theatre makers themselves. So much of research in the humanities is kind of theory-led, and this is a huge conversation now within humanities disciplines in fieldwork. What comes first, theory or the actual fieldwork? I kind of use the theoretical frame of Habermas's, post-Habermas public sphere theory to sort of ground my own thoughts. But really throughout the book, what I've tried to do, the main methodology I've tried to adopt was to bring the voices of the people I was speaking to and who were responding to me to the forefront.
Yeah, I think that is very well readable, actually, that you do this and that you try and really incorporate all those different voices, and not only just the voices, but really also the faces, not in terms of a visual representation, but really in the attempt of humanizing exactly practitioners and their experience, their reports about struggles and perhaps also great achievements. It allows in kind of a really beautiful similarity to what you attest Palestinian theatre to have a capacity of, namely to humanize and to re-epidermalize, I think is the term that you sometimes use, Palestinians and their livelihoods, their lives, their practices and their culture in a way. And I think that kind of also brings me to a question about collaboration as a bigger term. We've discussed before we had this having this webinar now, and we've discussed a bit where we could lead you. And I think what you've just described is also a practice, an academic practice of collaborating with your subjects, if you will, and to just really navigate what is the voice that you yourself as an academic find when researching, but also what is the voice and space that you inevitably kind of have to give and leave for others to fill with their own voices and shine with their own words. And stepping aside from the academic practice now, what you focus on in the later chapter of the book is in fact to show in really minute performance analysis and observations from rehearsals also, is how practitioners in different ways try and collaborate with each other, with researchers who kind of give like a topic that they may want to research and learn more about. For example, you have this one project that discusses women's issues, and preceding the actual performance work was an academically interested woman who wanted to do this research about how do Palestinian women live, what are their challenges, what are their daily experiences. And this in turn then led to a performance that was being set up. So this one kind of nurturing of actually the lived experience and context that then feeds back into a theatre play, or the writing of a play, and eventually the devising of a performance, that kind of collaboration I find really interesting. But you do offer several other collaboration practices. And I think one of the most interesting for me also personally in my own research was also the collaboration with practitioners from abroad, in terms of them coming in to join productions as, for example, directors or as playwrights, as producers, assistants, but then also, what you mentioned earlier, kind of as allies and ambassadors of Palestinian theatre abroad, facilitating tours. So these three kinds of different plateaus of collaboration, I think you detail in really beautiful examples and very concrete observations, but perhaps you could give a general thought of what this collaboration is able to facilitate. And if I understand correctly, that devising of a shared political language seems to be at the forefront of most practitioners when they decide to collaborate. And perhaps you could speak a bit more about how they're collaborating.
So collaboration since the late 90s has become so collaborative practices between theatre makers across continents and, you know, very different sort of geographic contexts as well, social and geographic contexts, has become a big thing. The number of international performances being toured and produced by Palestinian companies has risen exponentially. We've never seen this before the 90s. So collaborative practices themselves are already hemmed in by questions around politics and ethics. So when you have a British company or a British director going out to a context such as Palestine and working with locals, what kinds of questions, political, ethical, and so on, do they raise? So the two plays that in the book that I look at with in reference to this question are Ashtar's This Flesh Is Mine, which was produced in collaboration with British company Border Crossings, and that is This Flesh Is Mine is a kind of radical modern interpretation of Homer's Iliad, the Siege of Troy. So immediately when you think of the Siege of Troy, there are situations with which that resonates. The Siege of Gaza, for example. Even though the script and the playwright Brian Wooland were very kind of adamant that the story wasn't an allegory of Palestine, they were very quick to accept that, you know, being performed by a Palestinian company, of course, is going to resonate with the lives of Palestinians. The other one that I looked at was the Sign Is Our Stove, which was produced by the Freedom Theatre. I think it was back in 2013, which was directed by two English theatre makers, a director and a playwright. And of course, the other collaborative play was Shakespeare's Sisters, which was produced by Al-Harah with the Italian director Floridia. Sorry, I forget his surname. So what I was trying to look at when thinking through these collaborations was to try and work out how theatre makers in such completely different political, economic, and social contexts navigate this huge task of putting on a performance event. You know, and not just the task of performing, directing, scenography, and so on, but just producing the text of the play. How does that take place? What conversations do they have? What do they negotiate? What are they navigating around? So what I found in my research, and I have to sort of point out that these are my ideas. I don't present them as absolutes, and I would be horrified if anyone took these ideas as absolutes. What I hope is that other people might take the book and develop it and find other things as well, because since I wrote the book, theatre, the landscape has altered somewhat. I started to notice that the creators in the room were developing three kinds of languages. So the aesthetic language, which I use to refer to the product itself, the event, the performance. They were also creating a methodological language, which is the actual process itself. So how are they talking about plays during rehearsals? How are they sort of analyzing the text? How are they discussing character? How are they discussing scene, and so on and so forth? And then the final, which in this context, certainly in my discussions with Iman On and Michael Walling, who produced This Flesh Is Mine, the third language, the political. How are you talking about the political landscape around you? And also, how are you discussing, acknowledging the way social relations within the rehearsal process are also governed, structured by the politics of privilege. So when like a Western company goes over to Palestine, there is an inherent privilege there. What was interesting, I mean, the aesthetic language, it's very kind of, rehearsals are in themselves beautiful processes. They can be difficult, they can be complicated, but they're not impossible. You know, part of the rehearsal process is basically to, you know, everyone in the room is agreeing on a physical vision of what they're reading on the page. And again, the methodological. So how are performers, directors approaching the rehearsal process itself? And I noticed with Our Sign is the Stone, the play produced by the Freedom Theatre in response to the violence taking place in Nabi Saleh, was that they would, at the start of rehearsals and the end of rehearsals, they had, they'd established a kind of ritual of entering in and exiting that space. And that could be through theatre games, it could be through discussion, you know, analysis of the script and so on. The political one was, you know, everyone I spoke to said that this was actually the most difficult to establish, a common political language. As something Emil Saba, who's an actor at Ashtar Theatre, told me was that if you want to produce a play about Palestine, you have to come here and see things for yourself. Because there's a difference between reading about oppression and seeing it with your own eyes. And the company that produced, the British company that collaborated in producing This Flesh Is Mine, saw that for themselves. The act of walking through the old city of Jerusalem, going through Kalandia checkpoint, looking around and seeing, oh, okay, the Palestinian villages are here, but the settler colonies are all on a hill looking down at us in a very Kafkaesque sort of manner. That kind of witnessing, it leaves a mark on you as a creative, as a director, as an artist. So then they found that through this act of witnessing, of seeing, of their own embodied experiences, the way they were talking about the politics of the play. So they established a way of talking about the political situation around them, but they found that also affected how they talked about the politics within the play. And establishing this language, in particular for This Flesh Is Mine, was very important because, I mean, anyone who's familiar with the Iliad, the basic premise is that Helen is kidnapped to Troy. The Trojans kidnap Helen, and that sparks the Great War. I mean, in a play that resonates with Palestine, this idea that Group A stole something that belonged to Group B and then a conflict emerged out of that is very problematic. So in order to discuss, well, what do we do about Helen in this play? Because the Palestinians are very uncomfortable about keeping her in there, and so were the British actors. They had to establish this political language to understand, in order to understand what, in a Palestinian context, Helen symbolized. So in the end, with that particular play, through establishing these various languages, Helen wasn't embodied on stage. There was no actor playing Helen, but I mean, in a really interesting way. I mean, she was there because the entire thing is about her. But actually, the focus was taken on Briseis, one of the other characters, who in the original Iliad plays a very minor role at the beginning to kind of be the spark, because she's the war booty that's stolen from Achilles, and then Achilles uses that as an excuse to remove his army from the battlefield. So this idea that Briseis is captured war booty took on a different kind of resonance with both the Palestinian and the British actors. So in the final draft, she acquired a much more complex presence in the play. And also that brought up questions of, well, you know, when Achilles gives her the offer, you know, at the end of this one, I'm going to take you back to Greece, and she refuses. So the question, so her categorical refusal to leave the land of Troy also resonates with, you know, Palestinian resistance, which is captured in the word sumud, this resilience of staying on the land, refusing to move from it, no matter how terrible it gets.
Yeah, I think what you just described, I think for me is a very complex narrative structure. And I just, because I now see a question popping up, and I want to encourage the audience here to just use the Q&A panel if you want to, and we bring in those questions at a time. But what I wanted to jump on now with what you described as kind of the becoming of the political narrative within the play in reference and in a very active and engaged conversation about this context of all participants, be they Palestinians, be they foreigners joining the production, and perhaps also eventually the audience members. I wanted to speak to you about another example that you have in the book that both you and I in different years had an opportunity to participate in, which takes this kind of political context really to the forefront of the aesthetic narrative, if you will, of a production, namely the Freedom Ride, a project by the Freedom Theatre, which was produced several years, once a year. It's kind of, just to give the audience a little bit of a idea, it's a tour throughout the West Bank that kind of features very prominent sites of political resistance, and a group of participants that is comprised of both international visitors, activists, academics, scholars, theatre makers, whomever, and also local Palestinian activists, academics, theatre students, to tour together through the West Bank, visit villages like in Abi Saleh, for example, anywhere else, like really from the north to the south. And in the year that I was participating, Jerusalem was actually for the first time ever part of the, what's it called? The tour plan, if you will. But it was really a tool for me in my own personal experience that took this discourse about how do we navigate the political space, and how do we witnesses, how are we able to actually empathize with struggles that, particularly as an international visitor, we may not know for ourselves. How did you experience this? I mean, as I said, we attended in different years and our roles were slightly different, but I think both of us were in fact participating observers in a sense, and also declaredly so said this is going to be a case study. So what was your experience of that? And just to tie it back to the theatre, during this ride, many of the sites visited, we did like different activities, like rebuilding things that were being destroyed by, well, people. But we also had the possibility to attend playback theatre performances that were brought up by a troupe of performers that were traveling with us. And I think that combination was really strong, sometimes really somewhat overpowering, because it was a very dense schedule the year that I attended. And it was just a tour de force of everything you ever wanted to witness about the Palestinian struggle. And I thought it was really interesting that theatre played such a dominant role in such a highly political tour. So maybe you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yes, I was on the 2016 Freedom. So okay, just to explain, sort of reiterate what the Freedom Ride is. So the Freedom Theatre took inspiration from the Freedom Riders of the 60s in the United States. So at the time when, so concurrent to the bus boycotts that were taking place, you'd have a group of Black activists who would just ride buses across America to highlight the effects of segregation. So the Freedom Theatre took inspiration from this and established the Freedom Ride, which is a tour of the West Bank, as you said, with international participants through sites of popular resistance. So places like Versailles in the south, the South Hebron Hills, the Jordan Valley, where residents are living under settler colonial attacks, attacks from the army, destruction of basic necessities for life, such as, you know, the clay oven outside the cave in which people are living. So I participated on the 2016 ride as a coordinator. So I mean, unfortunately for me, I think it would have been better if I did it as a participant and then did it as a coordinator. So I was experiencing the same thing in two different ways. The other thing about myself being in Palestine, and I talk about my privilege as a Westerner, but I am also a particular kind of Westerner. I'm not white, I'm brown skinned. So many times walking through occupied spaces or soldiers, I was always sort of reminded in my body of how growing up in London, boys of my background and the neighborhood I was growing up in would approach the police or look at, or more, rather not look at the police. You know, there were sort of resonances there. I'm not saying they were identical, but there were like the experience of racism. So me being in that space, it also made me very aware that that I was kind of in the middle between Palestinians, who, some of whom, especially the Bedouins, I don't look much different from. In fact, I had one Bedouin telling me that he thought I was one of them, his words. And on the other side, a group of 16, 17 white people on what after a while seemed to me like a tragedy tour. The motives behind the Freedom Ride, so you have internationals coming in, the act of witnessing, and their task is to write blogs, take photos, and then go back to their own communities wherever they're from, and most of them are actually from Western countries. And organize events and, you know, publicity and education events for their communities. That's all great. That's a great intention. And at the same time, they stay with local families, they stay in local villages, and they might help, as you say, to build infrastructure. So it could be a wall, it could be a well, or whatever the community needs. But there's a lot to be said for this kind of witnessing. You know, what seemed to me a lot of the time with the Freedom Ride was that there was no kind of explicit attempt at questioning the politics of this kind of witnessing. Why, for example, is there this this desire to build links with people living in Western countries when there are links that can be made elsewhere as well? And I didn't see much of that. Luckily, in the year that I was on the Freedom Ride, they had an Indian company, Janam. The Freedom Theatre had done a sort of collaboration with them. It's the first collaboration I've heard of between a Palestinian theatre company and one from the Global South. I mean, an active collaboration. So you had actors from the Freedom Theatre going to Delhi, staying with them, and then the Delhi actors coming to Palestine. And it just happened that their tour ran concurrent to the Freedom Ride. So they performed in places where we encamped as well, and they did performances for local residents. But again, we come back to that question, don't we, of what exactly is this kind of solidarity? There was one playback performance, the first one, and for people who don't know what playback theatre is, it's a way of using theatre as a form of therapy to address trauma. So you'd have a group of highly trained actors, and they have to be very, very highly trained and very attuned to their audience. It's incredible when you watch a playback theatre performance that's kind of top-notch. It's phenomenal what they can do. So you have the group of actors, and Kristin, is it the teller? No, the teller is the member of the audience who comes up with their story, and then you have the person,
I believe,
the conductor, the person who mediates between the audience member and the actors. So someone from the audience comes up, tells their story, or, you know, a traumatic experience. The coordinator will ask questions to elicit emotion, a sense of place, a context, and then mediate that to the actors, who will perform a scene or a set of scenes around that. And then the coordinator asks, the conductor asks the teller, the audience member, to reflect on what they've seen, if it was accurate or not, and what they would change. So the first one we had was in Jenin, just before the bus left for the tour. And the conductor invited the internationals to tell a story. So the first story we had was from a woman from Germany who told us the story of how difficult it is to travel with 2 passports, and the questions that she gets from from airport security staff, from air stewards, and so on and so forth. So what I mean is there seemed this kind of absence of reflection that actually being able to travel on 2 passports isn't really trauma. You know, there are people around you who are just unable to go from one village to the other. But I mean, on the whole, over the years, the Freedom Ride, I say this as reflection of my own experience coordinating the Freedom Ride, because it is very difficult to sort of manage the complex nexus of experiences and personalities and so on in the room. It becomes very difficult, as you would know from your own experience. But on the whole, in the long term, from what I know of the impact of the Freedom Ride, they do go off, the participants do go off and they write articles, they set up events in their local communities to educate the public on what's happening out there, on BDS, on fundraising as well for different organizations.
Yeah, I think your descriptions now also tie back beautifully to some of the questions that we've received, and I want to kind of dense them up a little bit in terms of highlighting what you just mentioned, mainly this kind of laboring for solidarity that these practices, not only just the Freedom Right, but very many Palestinian theatre productions seek in terms of like the solidarity within the Palestinian community itself. And when you first mentioned that you also have encountered quite a few Palestinians living nearby theatres, and maybe not aware that there is actually a theatre. But using that performative space to allow for a public discourse to happen. And in the book, you call it also the counter-public discourse, and helping in the formation of a subject, the abject counter-public subject formation, if you will. Perhaps we can talk about this in a minute, but what I wanted to also kind of tie back when you described for the Freedom Right just now with the question that we've received, is there also kind of a problematic element of fetishization that may happen, that kind of this strong focus and ultimate focus on being political also brings with it kind of a very essentializing images of this is the Palestinian struggle, this is the Palestinian discourse. So I think there's both you mentioned like kind of this the tragedy tour effect, or also this what you started out with, kind of this image of Palestinians as either terrorists or victims. So I think what I've observed in very many experiences of theatre in Palestine, but also in writing about it, is that there's such a huge demand of audiences, both local and international ones, to kind of see Palestine through the theatre stages or in them, and find the narratives somewhat confirmed. In their own minds, they may have been activists for a long time, or they may really want to learn more. But this kind of framing capacity, that's theatre in putting something on stage and staging a narrative, is kind of a really powerful political tool. And I think one question we have here is also really interesting to me in how it also forces this narrative that may be problematically homogenizing in a way, particularly for international audience members who are being tasked with this idea of go back home, labor for us, and like be in solidarity, be ambassadors. I think that was very strongly so a task of the Freedom Right, not of all other Palestinian theatre practices. But I thought that, yeah, there is a nexus there that I find very interesting and politically remarkable.
Yeah, I think there's an element of fetishization going on. People sort of locked in a discourse of victimhood, people that must be helped, people that must be saved. There was an article I read a few years ago on the NGOization of the West Bank economy, and the author refers to this sort of battalion of NGO workers as the missionaries of the modern era. And in a sense, that's what it is. This idea of saving people. I mean, I've never in any of my research come across Palestinians refer to themselves as, you know, this sort of, in this kind of discourse of victimhood. Yes, factually, they are victims of Israeli settler colonialism, but not in the sense that, you know, they are locked therein forever. Palestinians, in my experience, the Palestinians that I've spoken to have discussed their experiences in terms of the struggle to fight, the struggle to resist, And resistance and fighting, they are active words. They are not passive words. They are active words. They are not the words of people that just sit by and see themselves as victims and nothing can be done. The problem is that the way many Westerners enter the West Bank and their encounter with Palestinians, this seems to be the only lens through which they're able to watch a Palestinian play. So back to the question, what they have a theatre, it's this idea that people who are locked in this kind of victim state, it's surprising and brave and wonderful that they're all coming together to produce art. But art has existed in Palestine for hundreds and hundreds of years. It will exist, it's existed there before, and it will exist 100 years hence. So do you see, does that, I mean, my experience on the Freedom Ride with white activists and other British activists, these sort of power structures became very sort of apparent to me. So I try, I mean, I don't think I've gone into sort of that greater length discussing these things in the book, but they're important to talk about because they also frame how solidarity is done, what solidarity is, what it looks like. And that brings us all kinds of problematic sort of questions, doesn't it?
And it also, I think, brings us to another question, namely that of kind of well, being trained in a Western institution that I was myself a part of for very many years. There is this ideal that I think with researching applied theatre kind of gets a little bit shaken, very much so, in fact, if there is any kind of freedom of the arts, in a way, as a practice, whatever freedom is, whatever arts are. But what we're discussing for now is kind of what you just also said, like the practitioners struggle to participate in fighting and resisting and in contributing to the national liberation struggle of Palestinians, and kind of very clearly saying what else would we do it for. And I think that kind of is perhaps a question that theatre practitioners everywhere the world over need to ask themselves. What are we doing it for, really? Do we just want to play around? And I'm not belittling this La Polar kind of approach to any kind of cultural practice, but this being nestled into such political need and demand to really with impact contribute to the struggle is kind of really such a huge task for practitioners and audience members, in a way, if you will, to find their place in, you know, being just artists. Really not saying that there is anything inherently wrong with that, but at the same time being cultural resistance fighters. And I think that there is a different kind of freedom at stake, if it's not the freedom of art, but the freedom of Palestine or Palestinians in learning about these things and being exposed to the stories and experiences of others in the narratives that plays enable to be witnessed.
There was something you said there about the politics of the academic scene. I mean, we as academics are also witnesses. So on the Freedom Ride, I was a witness in two different ways: as a participant on the Freedom Ride, but also as an academic who has some understanding of the context in which we're riding. Many participants, for example, didn't know. They had very basic understanding of what was happening, what they were seeing. So there's a responsibility on us to witness and report. And many of our theatre colleagues in the West Bank work under appalling conditions, you know, and these have been very well documented. So a couple of years ago, a group of colleagues and I actually wrote an article in the journal Theatre Survey, just calling for a discussion about how we as theatre scholars and academics can show solidarity or support to our theatre practitioners who are also our colleagues in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The article didn't call for anything except a discussion about BDS and what that might look like in a theatre studies context. Usually, anything to do with BDS creates a storm of controversy, you know, and we were kind of expecting something like that, but there was complete silence. There were no angry letters to the editor about publishing this article, which we were surprised by, but the discussion that we wanted to take place did not take place. There was no response to this. Now, I don't know how to explain that kind of silence, and I think it would be unfair of me to try and infer some kind of intention of my colleagues, but that silence needs to be talked about and interrogated and replaced with a frank discussion, because theatre companies will tell you that every year they get hundreds of requests from BA students, master students, PhD researchers wanting to study their work. But we can't just go in and then leave and get our degrees and then continue with our careers. There has to be something structural and institutional in a way that we can, there has to be an institutional, a structural way of supporting our colleagues. But that discussion has yet to come. So solidarity, again, when I really think about it, is it's a complicated, or maybe it's a complex terrain. I don't know how to explain this silence from our colleagues.
Yeah, but it was very audible, the silence, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I have one question that takes us slightly away from this unanswerable, silenced question. I want to also thank the other people who typed questions. This one here is from Maha, and I'm going to just read it. It's several question marks, so bear with me, Gabriel. It may just be several questions, but I thought that there is something in it that I personally also wondered oftentimes about. So there goes. Why do you think there is a lack in awareness of the existence of theatre companies and theatre activities in the West Bank among Palestinians? Would you agree this is because the majority of productions are usually targeted at a particular type of audience that is detached from the reality of the daily life of a Palestinian? In other terms, it's not produced with the Palestinian themselves in mind. There is another part, but just to also create a follow-up of this, we've discussed quite a bit that these productions oftentimes also tour internationally, and we've discussed also examples now where an international audience within Palestinian spaces in Palestine would be a large part of the audience. So perhaps that kind of production attitude comes back to this developing a shared or devising this mutual language in terms of the political language. But I thought that this was a really interesting question in terms of the production style, like who do you do it for? And it's also bringing us back to the question of solidarity in ever so many ways, and how the theatre contributes to this kind of framing of a specific narrative for perhaps, and I would like you to think about this a bit, a specific audience that is, you know, maybe found or not found in Palestine.
I mean, this is also, I mean, I think Maha's right. A lot of the plays that go on international tours, they're actually the products of arts development funds. So where funding bodies are based in Europe or America, there is sometimes a requirement that they work with a company based in the funding country, and that company will always try to bring the production over to wherever they're based. there is an element of if these plays are going to end up somewhere like London or Berlin, then they have to be also consumable by a London or a Berlin audience. Storytelling in different traditions is very different. In different cultures, is very different. So the story itself, the product itself, has to be consumable. And I think Maha is right to the extent that a lot of these plays do have a type of audience in mind that, as she says, is detached from daily life. The audiences that I observed going to see This Flesh Is Mine were very middle class, very middle upper class Ramallawis, the educated, prosperous, they could speak English, well-traveled, etc. And when I put this to Michael Walling, who was the co-director of the play, he said, yes, our audience was a bit of a closed shop. But that's not to say that theatres, they don't try hard to bring local audiences to local productions, and but there's an occupation going on. Yeah. So someone from a remote village has to navigate through multiple kinds of occupied spaces in order to attend a festival or a performance. What theatre companies often do is they tour locally. So, for example, a play by Nizar Zobi, I think is based in Haifa. His play, My Name is Yusuf, which was performed at the Young Vic, I think it was back in 2010 or something. That toured Palestine before it arrived in the UK. The Siege, for example, the Freedom Theatre produced, before it came to the UK, it was performed in Jenin as well. The other thing to bear in mind when we're talking about audiences in this way is that audiences in different parts of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the 48 territories, they're very different. So a Jenin audience is not often the same as a Ramallah audience. A Jenin audience is basically residents from Jenin refugee camp. Rowwad performance, for example, much the same, the Aida refugee camp. So, so we have to also be aware of, what kind of audiences we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think also what you just mentioned brings me back to another question that I only just now saw, kind of the fragmentation of the Palestinian geographical space, be that the West Bank with the different settlements that you can't really pass by or traverse, be that Gaza, the productions within Gaza, they're not within the scope of your book, but if you want to say something, if you could mention some things. But what I just now heard and also saw for myself, this the understanding for very many theatre makers in the West Bank and in companies in the West Bank that your book focuses on is to actually really make it accessible. And if that means people from remote villages cannot travel to Ramallah and see it in the theatre building itself, the production is tailored in a way so that it can be kind of traveling and traversing the space that it otherwise
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the audience of This Flesh Is Mine would have had to be able to speak English in order to watch the play. Yeah. But most plays themselves are in Arabic, or mostly in Palestinian Arabic, in fact. So, and also, I mean, the actors themselves are Palestinians who are embedded in those networks, local networks. So to say that a performance is made solely with a touring audience is in mind, it's partly correct, but it's not in the entire story, because rehearsal, producing a play is a process. If it's a 6-week rehearsal process, and that's 6 weeks worth of discussions and arguing and, compromising and negotiating. So, it's a bit more layered than just, this play is produced for this audience.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to come back to one of the questions that was asked earlier. Well, actually, it was the first one to arrive by someone called John K. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Gabriel, you are yourself a brilliant playwright. Thank you, Jen. I agree. How did that experience of being a playwright, if I understand correctly, influence your research? And I want to connect it with a question that I also thought I wanted to ask you. You write, or you have written the book from within an academic discourse. We're discussing it in this academic frame now, but I think very many people, be they academics or not, will find your book super accessible in terms of how you chose to write and which style of wording you chose, and how accessible in a way the research that you carried out is for readers. But I think this question of like being a writer and how such an experience of researching and then putting it on words is something that I wanted to, just as a kind of parting question, pose to you. And then
first of all, I'm not a brilliant playwright, and I don't say that out of modesty. I'm not one of those people that's plagued with modesty. I'm telling you, I'm not a brilliant playwright, but I have written and directed plays. So how did that experience influence my research? Well, working in theatre, it kind of gives you an idea of the inner workings, how to behave in a rehearsal room that's not your own. When to approach actors, when not to approach them, but also understanding the sort of close readings of play texts and so on, analyzing character, world building, and so on. So in terms of writing, and thank you for saying it's accessible. I mean, that's what I was trying to make sure the book was accessible reading, because the primary audience that I had in mind for the book were the people I was interviewing. I was in when I started my my fieldwork, the very first fieldwork that I went on, I was interviewing a director, and I just mentioned to him that that I'd read an analysis of one of his plays in a book written by an American scholar, and what are his opinions on this scholar's conclusions, a Palestinian director, I mean. He pointed to a bookshelf behind me and he said, "It's there. I haven't picked it up because the language is so hard to understand." There's an accessibility question here, right? I mean, the people that we're interviewing, that essentially we're writing about, should be able to, you know, access. I mean, they shouldn't require like 4 degrees in order to read this book, which is essentially about them. So that was the primary audience. The second audience were actually theatre practitioners. And the third audience were my friends, who most of whom are not academics. And the final audience was actually the academics. So that in the writing, in turning the dissertation into a book, I was able to kind of think through these different types of audiences and try and adjust the register accordingly. At the end of the day, I mean, academic writing can only be rigorous, and you know, I hope the book is rigorous, but I was mainly striving for accessibility, because the thing is, we can't talk about political theatre, any kind of political theatre, without also talking about Palestinian theatre. And when I started this this research, Palestine was actually absent from that conversation. Wherever I applied to do my PhD, this was the response I got. It's such an important area of study that no one's done, and it's so integral to talking about political theatre. We can't talk about migration and theatre without talking about Palestinian theatre. We can't talk about refugees and theatre without talking about Palestinian theatre, or prisoners in theatre without talking about Palestinian theatre. There are so many entry points and so many discussions that Palestinian theatre opens up and connects with. So whilst making sure that the book is academically and theoretically rigorous, I wanted to make sure that it was accessible to people working in those fields as well.
Brilliant. Thank you for creating such an excellent kind of exiting point, because I think we're going to, in fact, close this webinar very soon. I want to thank you, Gabriel, for giving us such beautiful insights and such accessible insights. And I think particularly your last words now really should alert everybody that any discussion, not any discussion, but very many discussions that we want to have on political topics surely have different fields of inquiry, and we can learn from those different kind of inquiries, and looking at fields that may seem a little off on the political day-to-day news, but will teach us a lot about the struggles that those daily news kind of report on. So thank you very much for allowing us this view in. I hope everybody has a better understanding of what we've been discussing. Thank you very much to the Kenyan Institute, and Taufik, you wanted to say a few words. And
well, I simply wanted to thank you both for a very interesting webinar today. From what we saw today, we basically had more than 50 people in the height of summer during a pretty peak time of the year, of the day, hanging out just to ask their questions and listen to what you had to say. So I think that sort of demonstrates a fairly large and widespread interest in this topic. And I myself wanted to raise some questions that I feel weren't able to be answered. So I kind of look forward to being able to check out a copy of the book when it's available, or when we can get a copy of it here. I congratulate you on the book, and I thank you, Dr. Flade, as well, for your discussant. You were able to facilitate a very interesting discussion. Please check out the book. It came out recently from Palgrave this past March. Support your local bookshop if you can, of course. This webinar overall has been sponsored by the Council for British Research in the Levant. And please check us out on the website. A recording of this talk will be made available probably in the next 24 hours, which you can download and share or whatnot, as well as you can find on our website our future upcoming webinars and all the different things that we do regarding research in the Levant. So check us out, become a member, find us at cbrl.ac.uk. So thank you for your time here today. Thank you to our discussant and our speaker, and have a good evening.